Picture this. A 14-year-old girl stands barefoot on the deck of a steamship, watching the coastline of Hong Kong disappear into the gray morning fog. She has no money. She speaks no Cantonese. She has never been more than 40 miles from the farm in Ontario where she was born. In her coat pocket is a Bible so worn the spine is cracked open and been wrapped in brown paper twice. She carries nothing else. The year is 1902. Her name is Susanna Firth. And before she dies, she will walk 1,100 miles on foot through the mountains of China with 104 orphaned children, chased by an army to safety on the other side. But that moment is still 37 years away. First, there is the farm. Susanna was born on a bitter February morning in 1888, in a clapboard farmhouse outside Guelph, Ontario, the third of 7 children. Her father, a Scottish-born Presbyterian who had come to Canada with nothing and built the farm by hand, was a man of few words and enormous expectation. Her mother was gentle and tired in the way only women who have buried 2 children before their second birthday can be. The family was not poor, exactly, but they were never far from it. There were chickens, there were debts. There were cold winters when the pipes froze, and everyone slept in the kitchen near the stove. Susanna was the strange one. Even as a small girl, the other children sensed it without being able to name it. She didn't flinch at the hard things. When a calf was born dead on a March night and her brothers looked away, Susanna was the one who knelt in the mud beside it and stayed there until her father came. She was 12 when the Methodist Missionary came through their county on a speaking tour, a lean man named Reverend Aldous Park, who had spent 20 years in Shanxi province. He showed lantern slides in the church hall, dark photographs of famine, of children with swollen bellies, of a country so vast and so broken that no single life could touch the edges of its need. Susanna sat in the third pew and did not move for 90 minutes. Walking home that night in the November cold, her father beside her, she said, "I think I have to go there." He didn't answer, but he didn't say no, and with him, that was almost the same thing. Have you ever been in a room where something shifted so completely that the air itself felt different afterward? Have you ever heard something? A sentence, a story, a single fact, that you couldn't unfold yourself from? That's what that lantern show did to Susanna Firth. She was 12 years old, standing in a church hall in Ontario, and something reached down and turned her like a compass needle. She spent the next 4 years preparing for something she couldn't fully explain. She learned what she could. She read every book Reverend Park left behind. She wrote to the China Inland Mission when she was 15 and received back a polite letter explaining she was too young, too inexperienced, and, though they didn't say this outright, almost certainly too female to be of much practical use. She wrote again when she was 16 and 17. The answers grew slightly less polite each time. In the spring of 1902, a woman from the mission came through Guelph. Margaret Stein, 52 years old, returning to China after a year's medical leave, a woman so direct she made Susanna's father look meandering by comparison. She met with Susanna for an hour in the parlor, asked her questions, most of which had no comfortable answer. Why do you want to go? What skills do you have? Can you endure discomfort without requiring sympathy? Can you follow orders from someone you believe is wrong? Susanna answered every question without flinching. Margaret Stein wrote to the mission board the following week. "She's not ready," Stein wrote, "but she will be, and she won't wait for us to decide that." 3 months later, with $22 sewn into the hem of her coat and a letter of conditional acceptance from the mission, Susanna Firth left Guelph on a train heading west. She was 14 years old. Her mother stood on the platform and did not cry, which was worse than crying. Her father shook her hand and held it for a long moment without speaking. She didn't see them again for 11 years. The first years were brutal in the ordinary ways. She arrived in Shanxi province in the autumn of 1902 and immediately discovered that everything she thought she understood, about faith, about service, about what it cost to choose an unconventional life, had been understood from inside a warm house, with supper on the table and a mother in the kitchen. Reality was different. Reality was a different language, a different culture, a different body of knowledge for which she had almost no preparation. She fumbled through the tones of Mandarin until her head ached. She made social errors that her supervisor, a patient German woman named Sister Hilde, had to quietly correct each evening over tea. She misread situations. She said the wrong thing at the wrong moment. She didn't quit. That's the part that matters. Hundreds of people went to China in those years with good intentions and returned home inside of 2 years, defeated by the relentlessness of the gap between what they'd imagined and what they found. Susanna stayed, not because it was easy, and not because she didn't feel the full weight of her isolation. She did, in letters home that she sometimes couldn't finish because her hands shook, but because she believed, with the stubborn certainty of someone who has made a decision at the level of bone and not just mind, that this was where she was supposed to be. By 1906, she was nearly fluent. By 1908, she was leading a small school for girls in a village outside Linfen, teaching reading, basic arithmetic, and hygiene to daughters of farmers who had never once considered that their daughters might need to know such things. It was improbable. It was slow. It was exactly the kind of work that produces no dramatic moments and almost no acknowledgement. And then the world changed. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. The revolution came. The warlord era followed, and with it, a decade of brutal instability that moved like weather across the country. Unpredictable, indifferent, devastating in ways that were impossible to anticipate. For Susanna, working in the interior provinces, this meant something specific and immediate. The children she worked with had no one. Their fathers went to wars that weren't named. Their mothers disappeared into poverty. The orphanages that existed were underfunded and overwhelmed. Susanna began taking them in. There was no dramatic decision made in a single moment. It happened incrementally, the way the most important things always do. First one child, then 3, then a household of 9 that she fed on a budget that made her predecessor shake his head. By 1920, she was running the largest unofficial children's home in the region, housing over 60 children in a compound that had been a merchant's warehouse and was now converted, room by room, into something that resembled a community. She had no formal authority to do this. The mission board in London approved it reluctantly, in stages, and always with the implicit understanding that it was slightly more than what they had sanctioned. This bothered Susanna very little. By 1930, she was known in the province simply as By May White Plum, the name the children had given her decades ago, which had spread the way names do when a person does one specific thing very well for a very long time. She was 42 years old. She had gray in her hair and calluses on her hands, and she had not been back to Canada in 28 years, and the worst of it hadn't started yet. In 1937, Japan invaded. If you know anything about what happened to northern China in the years that followed, you know it is not a thing that can be described quickly or cleanly. The violence moved through the province like a season. The city of Linfen fell in April 1938. The bombing started in late 1937, and Susanna, who had spent 3 decades learning to hold steady through difficult things, found herself holding steady through something that was on a different scale entirely. She could have left. There were evacuation routes. The mission board urged her to go. Some of her colleagues did go, and no one who understood the situation blamed them, but she had 104 children in her compound. Some were infants. The eldest was 15, and the only road to safety was a crossing of the Zhongtiao Mountains into the Yellow River Valley, and from there, south to Sichuan. A journey of over 1,100 miles. Through terrain that was difficult even in peacetime, now cut through with the movements of armies. She decided to walk. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. She decided on a May morning in 1938 that she and 104 children would walk out of the province on foot over the mountains to safety. She organized them. She counted supplies. She arranged for local guides at certain stages. She prayed with a kind of desperate, muscular urgency that she had never quite needed before. And then she started walking. The journey took 27 days. Children who could walk, walked. Children who couldn't were carried by older children, by the guides, by Susanna herself. The mountains were cold even in May. There was not enough food. On the 5th day, a 2-year-old girl named Lily spiked a fever so high her eyes rolled back, and Susanna carried her for 2 days straight before the fever broke. Susanna was 50 years old. She had recently recovered from typhus. Her feet were bleeding inside her shoes from the 3rd day onward. She didn't stop. On the 8th day, Crossing the highest pass, a boy named Peter, 12 years old, the eldest of the boys, self-appointed protector of the smaller ones, sat down on a rock and said he couldn't go any further. His shoes had given out 2 days earlier. He was walking on strips of cloth tied around his feet. Susanna sat down beside him. She didn't tell him it would be easy. She didn't give him a speech. She sat beside him for 4 minutes in the cold mountain air, this exhausted boy and this exhausted woman, and then she said quietly, "I need you." Not because it was strategic, because it was true. He stood up. They reached the Yellow River 18 days after leaving Linfen. They crossed by ferry in stages, 40 at a time. On the far bank, Susanna sat down on the ground and wept. Not from relief, but from something she could not name. Something that lives on the other side of extreme endurance, where the body and the spirit have been asked to give more than seems available, and have somehow found it anyway. The children gathered around her. Lily, the 2-year-old whose fever she had carried, toddled over and sat in her lap. That moment, that particular moment, was witnessed by a British journalist named Theodore Hirst, who had followed the crossing from a distance. He wrote about it in the Times of London 3 weeks later. The piece ran on a Tuesday morning in June 1938, and by Thursday it had been reprinted in newspapers in Canada, in Australia, in the United States. Nobody in Guelph, Ontario had heard from Susanna Firth in years. Some assumed she had died. The morning after the piece ran, her mother, 81 years old, still living in the farmhouse outside Guelph, still unbroken, read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her. She read it twice. Then she folded the newspaper very carefully along its original crease and set it on the shelf above the stove and went back to her mourning. It was the closest she came to crying. The children reached Sichuan in July, all 104 of them. Not a single one was lost. Here is what the newspapers didn't fully describe, because newspapers in 1938 didn't know how to describe it. The physical cost of what Susanna Firth paid for that walk was not something she recovered from. She had run her body past a threshold it couldn't fully come back from. The typhus, the 2-day stretch of carrying Lily, the altitude, the weeks on insufficient food. It had taken something from her permanently. She was 50 years old when the walk began. She was not well again in the way she had been before. She knew it. She kept working anyway. The children were resettled. Some went to relatives. Some went to other mission homes. Some stayed near Susanna in a temporary compound in Chengdu that became, as her compounds always became, something more permanent than originally intended. She wrote to the mission board. She wrote to contacts in Canada. She arranged funding in the understated, persistent way she had always arranged everything. Not through grand appeals, but through the slow accumulation of trust with people who had learned to take her seriously. In 1940, she was offered a teaching position at a training school in Chengdu. She accepted. She taught until 1947. The communist takeover in 1949 changed everything again. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Susanna, now 61, was given 30 days to leave a country she had lived in for nearly 5 decades. She stood in her room in Chengdu on the last night, in the room she had occupied for 7 years, and looked at the objects she had accumulated. The worn Bible, 3 photographs, a small wooden cross a boy named James had carved for her in 1923, a list of names she kept in a notebook that was now almost too full to close. She packed what fit in one bag. She didn't look back at the room when she left it. She came back to Canada in November 1950, 48 years after she had left. She was 62 years old. Her parents were gone. Her siblings were old. The farmhouse outside Guelph still stood, but it had passed out of the family. She went to see it anyway, drove out one afternoon with her nephew, stood at the gate for a while without going in. She didn't cry. She settled in Toronto and immediately began doing what she had always done, working. She spoke at churches. She wrote. She became, in the years that followed, one of the most sought-after voices in Canadian missionary circles. Not because she was dramatic or flamboyant, but because she had a quality that was impossible to fake. She had actually done the thing. She had not imagined the cost and found it acceptable in theory. She had paid it. In pieces, over decades, in the cold of mountain passes and the heat of Shanxi summers, and in 30 years of being far from everyone she had grown up with. People who heard her speak said the same thing in different words. She didn't perform conviction, she just had it, in the bone. She died in Toronto on a March morning in 1963. She was 75 years old. At her bedside were her nephew, her closest friend from the mission years, a Scottish woman named Evelyn McTavish, who had known her since 1909, and a man of 45 whose name was David Liang, who had been one of the children on the walk. He had grown up in Sichuan, come to Canada in 1955, built a life, had children of his own. He sat beside her bed and held her hand in the last hours and did not speak. He didn't need to. There is a question worth sitting with after a life like Susanna Firth's. Not the question of whether it was worth it. That's too easy to answer from the outside and too private to answer from the inside. The real question is harder. It is this. What does a person have to believe, not think, not assume, but believe, at the level where it costs something, to make the choices she made, to leave at 14, to stay when everything said go, to walk 1,100 miles with 104 children on bleeding feet because there was no one else? She didn't leave a manifesto, she didn't write a systematic theology. What she left was the walk itself, and the people who survived it, and their children, and their children's children, who are alive today because she stood up on a May morning in 1938 and decided that what she had left was enough to start with. The question is never whether the cost is too high. The question is what you believe is on the other side of paying it. If you want to explore more lives like Susanna's, ordinary people who chose extraordinary obedience, stay with us here at Circle of Voices. Subscribe and come back for the next story, because the one that comes next will ask you the same question in a different way. And the answer, whatever it is, should come from somewhere deep enough to hold.